In 2020, America's murder rate experienced its sharpest increase since the FBI began keeping national records on cases in 1960. Data from the FBI's Uniform Crime Report indicates that America has endured a 29% increase in murders from 2019 to 2020. This increase is the largest one-year leap since a 12.7% increase in 1968. The data also shows that 77% of murders last year involved the use of firearms, a statistic that criminology experts believe directly correlates to a 64% increase in gun sales in 2020. According to the National Shooting Sports Foundation, 40% of those gun sales were reportedly to first-time gun owners. Per the FBI report, the increase in firearm ownership, pandemic stress, distrust in police, and a pullback in policing all have contributed to the uptick in murders. The irony of the increase in murders is that the major crimes overall have fallen nearly 5% in 2020. Not only that, but 2020 also was the 18th consecutive year that America witnessed a decline in overall crime. Joining us to discuss is retired Baton Rouge Police Chief Murphy Paul and Sacramento Police Chief Daniel Hahn. Mr. Hahn, how do you kind of explain this incredible rise in homicides while the rest, overall crime rates, major crime rates, is actually going down?
Yeah, we have the same thing here in California and in Sacramento. I think it's several things at the same time, so like a perfect storm. But it's still not anywhere near the levels that we were at in the late 80s and early 90s, but it is significantly more than we've had in the recent past. And I think part of it is COVID, where people have lost their jobs and times are tough and they've been locked down basically for the last year and a half. Part of it that coincides at the same time, partly due to COVID. We've let more people out of custody or not put people in custody in the first place with zero bail and significant releases from prison institutions. At the same time, we've had all the unrest that we've seen across the country that pulls officers out of the neighborhoods and puts them onto skirmish lines and things like that for the protests. So there's a lot of things that have unfortunately happened all at the same time. And that is coupled with a lot of police departments are having staffing challenges in the first place. And so it's kind of like a perfect storm where everything's happening at the same time. And unfortunately, one of the results is violent crime, as other crimes are either staying steady or going down.
Chief Paul, law enforcement is kind of in a tug of war here. On the one end, there are people who want massive reforms, and some people want to defund the police altogether. And on the other end, there are people saying, look at this enormous spike in homicides. We need more policing, not less. Is it possible to have reform and to combat this rise in homicides?
Yeah, I think we can have both. I don't think defunding the police is the option. When you talk about reform, one of the things we talk about in reform is, to retrain a law enforcement officer. That takes a lot of resources. I think community policing, systemic reform is necessary for our profession. But I think, as the chief stated earlier, what COVID and has done to communities all across America, it's created a lot of trauma. When we look at mental health and our emotionally disturbed persons calls and how that has increased, when we also look at overdoses and how it too has increased. I think there were so many systems that were put in place to help us reduce crime, right? Churches were not gathering, playgrounds were empty. All of those things, I think, had negative consequences. And I think that's what we actually saw. We saw a closer relationship between victims and suspects. We saw an interruption in the drug trade. So all of those things, I believe, like the chief said, it was like this perfect storm of things that happened that has caused this increase in homicides. But we are starting to experience some changes in that. You know, one of the things that we do as law enforcement agencies, we look at trends and we make those adjustments in an ever-changing environment. So I think we're starting to see some success to get some of the crime down in some areas, and we have to keep doing that. But I think we can have both, and I think it's important to understand that reform is necessary as we continue to move forward. But we have to understand that social media has made the world so small. And every incident that happens in another jurisdiction, it makes its way to our front doors. So we have to deal with that. But we have to embrace law enforcement. We have to address these issues of morale in law enforcement. We have to encourage people in the community to become public servants and to come and be those change agents, because the morale that's happening nationally, you know, we're seeing increases in resignations and also increases in early retirement. So we have to change that narrative.
Chief Hahn, I want to ask you about this idea of that Chief Paul was just talking about, which is morale and, you know, officers leaving the force for whatever reasons. And also, you know, one of the things that criminologists were pointing out about these data were that, you know, the idea that there could be some intentional pullback among officers, just kind of just refusing to do the job, you know, to its fullest. Do you think that that is at all part of what is happening here, or do you see that at all?
Yeah, it's definitely not as proactive as it used to be if you look at just the raw numbers, but I think that is way oversimplifying the cause of those things. So one of the big causes is we are understaffed. We have less staffing now than we did 10 years ago. And the calls have increased significantly. And so the officers don't have as much time to be proactive. But I do think that is part of it. When officers are going through all that's happened over the last year, feel a lack of support in certain areas of whether it's the elected officials or whatever, I think it's human nature that some of them might be pulling back a little. But the other thing is we've had numerous protests in our city that take hundreds of officers. So those officers are no longer in the neighborhood to do proactive work. They're at a protest. But I think we've been fortunate in Sacramento. We have not had the mass exodus of officers that some of the other major cities have had. But I'd be lying if I didn't say both the community and officers are frustrated with current times. And unfortunately, what tends to happen is we do all what oftentimes we call police reform or these reforms, and we do that for a while. Crime starts to go up, people get scared, and then we flip back to the other extreme, and we keep going from one extreme to the other, when in reality, we need to be in the middle somewhere. We need to find real solutions, because these protests in our streets, the unrest, the anger that we have in every community across this country is not new. Even though we tend to call it unprecedented times, they are not unprecedented times. We've had these protests in cities across this country for the last couple hundred years. And the problem is we've never really addressed the root cause of these things. And so they have continued, and they have continued to cause harm to both community and law enforcement alike.
Chief Murphy Paul and Chief Daniel Hahn, thank you both for joining me tonight, gentlemen.